I wanted to let you know about a campaign that I'm taking part in called hashtag 2Pods a Day. It's designed to introduce you to 2 independent podcasts every day for the month of July. We hope to give visibility to some great indie podcasts that you probably haven't heard of. Hashtag 2Pods a Day encourages you to listen more, listen indie. Find more shows like mine by following hashtag 2Pods a Day on Twitter and on Facebook. After all of your professional accomplishments, Scott, do you think that you'll be best remembered as the creator or the inventor of the emoticon, the internet emoticon?
Well, certainly by the general public. Some people in my area may understand my research accomplishments and appreciate them, but, they don't, the general public may know I've done something in AI, but I've had to come to terms with the idea that the first sentence in my obituary is going to be inventor of the smiley emoticon.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Scott Fahlman. He's a pioneer in the area of artificial intelligence, but you may know his work in a different way. He's largely considered the inventor of the first internet emoticon. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we're going to talk with Scott about something he did as an afterthought and for fun in 1982 that took on a life of its own. It's now used by millions of people every day around the globe. We'll explore what his simple creation may say about the very essence of human communication. The emoticon is a term that's short for emotive icons. Emoticons have been around for centuries in various forms. What all emoticons have in common is that they appeal to or express some form of emotion, and they are icons, not words. But today, when we use the term emoticon, we're usually talking about the internet variety. And that's what brings us to our guest today, Scott Fahlman. Scott, today we're going to talk about the first internet emoticon. But before that, can you tell us about your primary work and the work that you've done since?
Yes, my whole career I've been interested in artificial intelligence and specifically in trying to get a handle on the things that we humans are so good at without being trained or thinking about it. When I started, and this was in the early 1970s, started as a grad student, people were working on AI in all sorts of different ways, but a lot of the things were so-called expert systems. They were working on matching drugs to diseases, creating AI systems that would do computer algebra and so on. And I was interested in understanding speech, in the kind of common sense we have just to get through the day, the kind of planning we do when we've got a shopping trip, but we have to stop 3 other places. And that's really been the quest for my whole career, and we still don't have that in AI.
What do you think the challenges are today for AI?
I'm sure anyone who's read the newspapers know that AI is very, very popular right now because there's suddenly been some breakthroughs in image understanding, in understanding speech, in translating languages. But it's almost all sort of sensory motor stuff. What we don't have a handle on yet is conscious thought, the kind of symbolic things where you can feel yourself thinking about it. And that's still the missing bit, the sort of higher levels, the more conscious symbolic levels of human intelligence. And all these trained up deep learning nets that are all the rage right now are very good at matching patterns, but they don't create interesting complex structures and then think about them and compare them and reason with them. And so that's the missing bit. And then getting all the common sense knowledge into the machine. People know millions of things about just how to go through a door. There's different kinds of door handles and it might say push or pull and there might be a lock and you might need a key and all those things. And everybody knows that. That's what we call common sense because it's common.
You're one of the few people who has spent so much time on artificial intelligence and for so long. When you first started working on artificial intelligence projects, and you started to look ahead towards the future, did you have any idea that we would have made this much progress by this date, or did you think that we would be further ahead than we are now?
Well, actually, we were all very optimistic in the early days. People were focusing on these things that were hard for people, chess and computer algebra and so on. And they sort of had some ideas about how to do that. And those were the first things that kind of fell to AI, that were conquered one by one. First tic-tac-toe and then backgammon and then chess, and now it's Go and poker. But it took a while for it to dawn on us that all this stuff that people do without thinking about it and without being taught, you're learning your native language. Nobody sits down and teaches you. Maybe they teach you to polish it later on. But by the time you're 4 or 5, and nobody's given you how to speak English lessons as a baby, but somehow you've picked up this very complicated piece of knowledge. It took us a while to realize that that was actually the bigger part of what we had to solve. And that's come quite slowly. I mean, I've spent my whole career on this.
And you're still working on it. Obviously, it's a work in progress.
Yeah, I think we're actually pretty close. But right now, there's a gold rush on the other kind of AI, on the machine learning, deep learning stuff. Suddenly, we can do things in vision and so on that we couldn't do before. So it's hard to get funding and attention for the kind of work I'm doing right now. But that's okay. I'm retired. I can do what I want.
Well, speaking of doing what you want, and now I know that you're spending more time talking about that one moment in your career that you never anticipated at the time, and you never anticipated the ramifications of it. And it's the emoticon, not just the emoticon, the internet emoticon. And I know that you had mentioned that it started before the internet. How would you describe the early days of the internet, which at the time was called the ARPA Net?
Right. So this was 1982. Actually, September 19th, 1982. But what we had in those days were, again, it was the ARPA Net. It was run by the Department of Defense, and they had research contracts with a dozen or so universities to be on this ARPA Net. We had email, one person to another, on the same computer for almost a decade. But we had just gained the capability of sending it to all the other machines, say, at Carnegie Mellon, and then to other machines elsewhere, to MIT, to Stanford, to Berkeley. And these were text-only messages. The terminals were text-only. In fact, they were the limited character set called ASCII, which was upper and lowercase, English letters, none of these funny German things, let alone Arabic. And you couldn't send a picture at all. That just was off in the future somewhere. So we were able to send text messages, letters, upper and lowercase, numbers, and some punctuation. And what we had immediately was social media. And this was just called bulletin boards. And I could send a text message not to another person, but to the bulletin board, and then everybody could read it. So it was like a chat room or like a news group that came along later, and now like posting on Facebook, but no pictures, no emoji, none of that stuff. It was just all text.
That was the beginning of the internet. Can you tell the story then about how you actually came up with the internet emoticon?
As soon as we had social media, even this primitive social media, we had flame wars. People would post something, and, being science nerds, we enjoy sarcastic humor. So we'd post something that was meant to be sarcastic, and somebody wouldn't get the joke. I mean, you're talking to, oh my God, like 20 people at once, all my followers. And if in that set of people, there's one who doesn't get the joke, and they say, oh, well, that's horrible. You can't say that. Oh, come on, and then 6 people jump on him. It was mostly hymns in those days, sadly. 6 people jump on that guy, and pretty soon whatever you were talking about is lost. It's just people arguing back and forth about whether, this was serious or not. There was a particular incident that caused us to think we had to label things that were meant to be funny explicitly as jokes. There was a conversation going on about what would happen if one of our elevators went into free fall. Okay, remember, science nerds only. And if there was a bird in the elevator, would it become disoriented because there's no gravity as you're falling? If there was a candle, would it go out because there's no gravity to feed the convection currents that are pumping oxygen into the flame? And what would happen? Some guy said, what if there was mercury on the floor, a little puddle of mercury? And his theory was it would grunch up into a ball and start to rise up as you're falling, just by the dynamics of that thing pulling together. And then somebody posted something that said, well, due to recent physics experiments, the leftmost elevator in the computer building is not to be used because of mercury contamination and flame damage, which we all thought was funny. But one of our administrators said, oh, that's horrible. You can't post that. Now I have to post something that tells everyone that the elevator is safe, that there's no mercury. And what if they only saw that one post? They wouldn't understand it was a joke. We thought, oh boy, as long as this guy's around, we're going to have to mark everything that's meant to be funny. So the discussion the idea was, what could we put in the subject line of a message, just a single horizontal line of characters that would say, hey, I'm only kidding. And you could put like joke, exclamation mark. That's not very good. Somebody said put an asterisk, but what does that mean? That could mean anything. And different characters were proposed. And I'm trying to think we ought to be able to do better. And back in the 60s, there'd been these smiley faces on T-shirts and balloons and things. Just very simple stylized smiley faces, 2 eyes and a mouth, and sometimes a nose in a circle, pretty much like today's emoji. But these were not on the internet. These were just T-shirts and things. And could we do something like that? So I'm looking at the keyboard, and it'd be cool if you could make a little smiley face, but one line of characters. What could we possibly do? First thing you need is eyes, and you can put 2 O's, but then there's no room for smiling mouth. And then I saw the colon character, and that looked like a couple of eyes, but sadly it's sideways, so that won't work. Went on and couldn't find anything else, and I came back to the colon. I said, well, maybe people would turn their head sideways and see this thing. You can make a really nice smiley face with a colon and a minus sign and a parenthesis. So I wrote a little 2-line message that said, for the joke marker, I don't remember the exact wording, but for the joke marker, I propose colon minus parenthesis and turn your head sideways. And then I said, the way things are going, maybe it's easier to mark only the things that aren't meant to be jokes. And that could be colon minus parenthesis the other way, frowning. So I posted that. I thought it would amuse the 10 people taking part in that discussion and would be forgotten the next day. So I didn't save a copy or anything. We didn't have a lot of storage in those days. You didn't save things you didn't really need. And damn, it caught on. It started spreading. So it spread all the way through Carnegie Mellon. I was seeing it in all sorts of emails from different people within about a week. And I thought, well, that's weird. And then within about a month, it had spread to the West Coast. Some of our alumni used to come back and look at our bulletin boards. And they were using this thing too. In fact, they were starting to make up new versions, with a capital P for the tongue sticking out and stuff like that. It spread from place to place, but just among these 12 universities. And that was the end of the world, and it couldn't go any further because nobody else had even these primitive computers or spend any time, sending messages to each other. And the timing was perfect because that same year they took the ARPA Net and they turned it over to civilian control. They said this should be a thing that all the universities can use. They gave it to National Science Foundation. They renamed it the Internet. And one by one, other universities joined. And when, you have friends at Ohio State or someplace and they've just joined, you send them an email. And some of those emails had the smiley face in it. And it just spread from place to place every time somebody new joined. So pretty soon, many of the universities in the U.S. that had computer science departments were using this thing. And then we had a connection to Japan and the UK and Europe, and on it went. So pretty soon this thing had spread. Within about a year or two, we had connections to other places, and this thing had spread every place the internet went. And now this was way before the World Wide Web and Google and all that stuff. And it was way before people had computers in their homes. Okay, we're talking 1985 or 1986. So it was only the computer nerd community that was seeing this thing and sending email to one another and including the smiley faces and all the other emoticons. And then people started making up little books of more complicated ones, Abraham Lincoln and the Pope being eaten by a python or something, which is a whole string of complicated characters. Somebody made up the name Emoticon. I've never been able to track down exactly who that was because I was calling them smileys, but they aren't all smiling, so that's not a great name. And Emoticon, I guess, is a better name, so that stuck. And then it wasn't until the mid-1990s that people had any reason to have computers in their home. Suddenly there were search engines and people were starting to have websites. You could look up movie times and so on. And suddenly the normal non-computer nerd population saw this thing for the first time. And they thought it was kind of cool, apparently. Hey, I know the secret language of the internet. I know this secret code that only the nerds have known until now. So suddenly the civilians are using it. And that's how it happened. The emoji came along within a few years after that.
You've actually been the first to say that yours was not the first emoticon. Can you describe basically emoticons that may have been developed or created before yours?
Yeah, people always wanted to fight about that. And I didn't make up the term emoticon, but it depends how you define it. If you define it as a sideways face on the internet, I think that was me. At least some people said, oh, the teletype operators back in the old days used to use that. Maybe so, but this was on the internet, and this is the one that spread. We could watch it spread. So what I will claim is inventing the version of the smiley and frowny face emoticons that spread and gave rise to a lot of these others, because we could see that happening. Now, am I the first person to type those 3 characters? Probably not. Am I the first person to use, if you want to fight over what was the first emoticon in English, I would nominate the exclamation mark, which goes back to Gutenberg and before, because it's a piece of text that conveys some kind of emotion, in this case, surprise or emphasis or excitement, and it doesn't spell it out in words. You don't say, oh, this is a joke, or hey, I'm really excited. It's just bang, exclamation mark. Now, they had to make up a new character, but they could do that in those days. They weren't limited to the agreed-upon set of computer characters. So that made it into the normal set of punctuation marks. So, let's not fight about the definition. I didn't do the first emoticon. That was it, as far as I know. Now, if you go back and look at hieroglyphics, there may have been smiling and frowning crocodiles, for all I know. But, in terms of English typography, that was probably the first one.
It took a while for you to find that original email that shows how you created that first internet emoticon. It was tracked down in 2002, almost 20 years after the original version. Can you describe the process for actually tracking that down?
Yeah, so as I said, I didn't save a copy. Who knew this was going to be? This was 10 minutes of my life being silly. I said something maybe funny, and I say funny things online all the time. And who knew this was going to be special? And I didn't save the message. And a month later, I realized this is really spreading. I wonder if I still have that message, but it had been deleted. Again, we didn't have much storage in those days. So, never mind. This thing's going to die off soon anyway. And it spread and it spread. Hey, this is becoming socially important. So can we find it on our backup tapes? Well, the backup tapes have been moved off campus and put in a vault. Oh, never mind. And it wasn't until much, much later, a friend of mine named Mike Jones, who was working at Microsoft, popped up and he said, we got to find that original message. Because all the people at CMU in those days remember your message and know it was you and remember this pretty clearly. We don't know the exact date or time, and a lot of people out there don't believe it. Who would believe that this is the guy who invented the emoticon? And we got to find that message. So I said, great, but it's going to be a big deal now. He said, yeah, okay, well, I'm going to fund the archaeological dig, and we're going to find this. And he was one of the guys back in his student days. He was a student at the time this message went out, grad student, who helped administer our computers, and he knew all about the backup system, so he knew where to look. And they went to the vaults where the ancient backup tapes were stored, found what was probably the right tape. Then they had to find a tape drive that would read that, because this was an ancient tape format. And then they had to find a computer that would talk to that ancient tape drive. And then they had to write some software to get it back to the point where it was talking to that tape drive. It was a big deal. And then they had to search. A fellow named Jeff Baird on our facilities staff was very instrumental in making this happen. Mike was funding it and cheerleading. And a bunch of our facilities staff helped out. And it really was an archaeological dig, but we found the thing. And there it was. There's the whole thread. And if you look on my website, you can see the original thread of messages that led up to my famous one.
What's your website?
If you just Google Fahlman Emoticon, you'll find something called Smiley Lore, and that has a pointer to this thread. So, we had the message back and we knew the date and time and everything. Now, I remembered it as being in the middle of the night because that's when I was doing these silly things, but it was 11 in the morning for some reason. I don't know. I must have been either up late or up early that day, but that was not unusual in those days. It was time-sharing systems and you had to work late in order to get any cycles. So we got the message back, and that just in time for the 20th anniversary, as it turned out. Every year on the anniversary, September 19th, I get requests for all sorts of radio interviews and so on from all around the world because people are doing stories. It's nice to be able to point them to the actual message now.
You had mentioned hieroglyphics earlier, and now I want to talk about communication, basic human communication, because I think even though we're talking about something that came so simply to you, it actually struck a chord with people because it struck at almost the human essence of communication. So my first question along those lines is, how far removed from ancient hieroglyphics are the internet emoticons?
So, yeah, people often ask me if this is turning into a language in its own right, as hieroglyphics did. And so far, I think not. So even with the full emoji set, with the hundreds and hundreds of emoji now that are defined and standardized, that's not a complete language. It's good for some nouns, some verbs, just a few verbs, and that's pretty much it, and happy and sad and a few things like that, some numbers, a lot of symbols for weather for some reason, and so on. But you can't say, well, I might go to the dance, but if Mary's there, I don't want to run into her. I mean, you just can't say that in emoji. There's no prepositions. There's no ways of putting together complicated thoughts that relate to one another. So we're still going to need language to fill in that part of the thing. There can be emojis sprinkled in, sure. And people enjoy that. It's a quick way of saying certain things. Hey, I'm having a good day. But they become very awkward if you try to. Somebody tried to translate Moby Dick into just emoji, and it's one of those things that if people tell you what the sentence was, you can kind of see that those emoji match. But you would never read that and know that this guy was obsessed with finding the whale. I don't think there's an emoji for obsessed. And what the Egyptians found was that they had these pictographs for wheat and various gods and so on. But to make that a language, they had to go to something more verbal. A lot of the things ended up standing for the sound. It became almost a phonetic alphabet mixed with the pictographs. And until you make that step and get back to something more like a human language, you don't have the full spectrum of things you can say.
What does it take for something to catch on? You've had a front row seat watching the internet emoticon spread. And I know you've had some thoughts about why it spread the way it did. And you have about 4 or 5 points that you've made that you explain as the reasons or the way things spread.
Yeah, well, PR people ask me this sometimes because they want to know how I accidentally created a brand that spread all around the world and that people like and that has lasted this long without a big promotion budget. And what's the secret? And I don't think there's a secret, but the key is that smiles are universal. Every human culture does it the same way. There's no culture that has been discovered where people turn their mouth down in order to indicate they're happy or turn their mouth up in order to indicate they're sad. So that's pretty universal to human beings. I think that's wired in. And smiles are powerful. It's you walk around and you smile at somebody, you've made their day a little better and your day a little better. So that's a good thing. So I'm kind of being parasitic off this basic human thing. The thing I like about emoticons that you don't get with emoji is that those characters are pure essence of smile. It's not a black person smiling. It's not a white person. It's not a male or female or an old person. And as soon as they make them into little pictures of faces, they have to argue about whether they've covered all possible faces, and has somebody been left out. And with those 3 characters, it's smiling face, it's much more universal. So I think the reason it spread is that it was simple, it's easy to use, it was free. People don't have to pay me every time they use it, sadly. And it tapped into this kind of basic human thing. Everybody understands it without it being explained to them.
You have said it fills a small need. It's an easy way to say that you're only joking, that you're either serious or you're unhappy.
Yeah.
And you used another term, too, that I liked, and it was called the in-group effect.
Oh, yeah. One thing that gives it a boost when it broke out into the general public, people like to use it because, hey, I know the secret language of the internet. Am I not cool? I've got a computer and I'm sending email, and look, I know the secret language. And then they use too many of these for a while. I mean, it becomes, they're trying to show that they're part of the in-group, but they're proving that they're newbies because they're using hundreds of these in a message. Just as people kind of go nuts when they have suddenly access to many colors in their messages or when they have access to lots of different fonts, they'll put 28 different fonts in a message. So people go crazy for a while. It gives them a little bit of group identity, I think. Hey, I know the secret language. And then after a while, it's just another thing.
How has the emoticon changed your life?
Mostly good. It's been a fun ride. I've come to terms with the fact that I'm probably never going to do anything in my long and reasonably successful research career that's going to match this in terms of just fame, especially with the general public. But, I get invited to some nice places. I get to talk to people. Every year we have an event on campus where we set up a little table in the middle of campus and all the undergrads come by. And they're amazed to learn, first of all, that somebody actually invented the emoticon. And second, that person is still alive. My God, how long ago was that? And third, that he's standing here signing T-shirts and is a Carnegie Mellon professor. So it's kind of fun. That's the day of 10,000 selfies.
Is there any one particular memory that you have since you've invented the emoticon that stands out for you? Did it create a moment in your life?
Yeah. A little over a year ago, I was invited by Wired magazine to give a talk in Florence about how these things were created. They have a big free event called the Wired Next Fest, and it took place in Florence in the Palazzo Vecchio, which is this beautiful Renaissance palace that the Medici built. And they were great patrons of the arts, so it's all full of masterpieces of Renaissance sculpture and painting, Raphael and Leonardo and Michelangelo. These things are, and their students, these things are all in this huge room called the Salon of the 500. And that's where I gave the talk. And I'm standing in the middle of this place with all these Renaissance masterpieces of art, giving a talk on the nerdiest thing ever invented. And it was like, this can't be real. I kept pinching myself, How can I be in this place giving a talk on this subject with people out in the audience having a good time and eating it all up and lots of selfies afterwards?
That's a great experience. Well, are there any lessons to be learned or any legacies from your experience in this case?
Well, you never know what's going to take off, so save a copy of everything. That's more feasible now than it was. If something like this happens, just have fun with it, ride it as far as it'll go, and it's fun.
Scott Fahlman, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Make sure to check out our show notes for more information on everything that we talked about today. You'll find a bio on our guest, Scott Fahlman, and you'll get links to more information on the story behind Scott and the Emoticon. You can also listen to other episodes, and don't miss the next episode. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast in many ways. They're all free and easy to find at your favorite podcast channel and at shapingopinion.com. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.